Hi everyone, and welcome to today's session on cyberbullying, in which we're going to take a look at what happens when bullying and harassment move online. We're pleased that you've been able to join us. This session is one of a series of interactive webinars hosted by Field Fisher's Employment, Pensions, Immigration and Compliance team, also known as EPIC. We're hosting a 30-minute session every Tuesday at 1 p.m, covering significant legal developments and hot topics, and offering practical advice for businesses and organizations in this ever-changing environment. Let us start by introducing ourselves. My name is Nick Thorpe, and I'm a partner in Field Fisher's employment team.
And my name is Hannah Disselbeck. I'm a senior associate in the employment team.
We will be covering a lot of ground during today's session. We'll start by setting the scene. While the focus of this webinar is on bullying and harassment in a lockdown and post-lockdown environment, this is not a new issue, and the wider context is important. We will then give a brief overview of what we mean by cyberbullying and harassment. We'll keep this quite high level. I expect everyone on this webinar has some experience of dealing with bullying and harassment issues, so we'll not go over the basics or the more technical aspects here, but focus primarily on the practical side. In the spirit of keeping it practical, we'll then look at the risk for employers in connection with bullying and harassment in the workplace. While I've said that these are not COVID-19 issues specifically, there are particular challenges for employers connected with the pandemic and having large numbers of employees working from home, so we'll briefly touch on these. We'll then move on to give you some practical advice on steps that you can take to protect against these issues arising, specifically where you have large numbers of employees working from home. In particular, we will look at how you may need to adjust your approach in the current situation if concerns do come to light. Finally, we'll touch on situations where third parties become involved in harassment issues and situations where employees' personal lives may bleed into their professional lives. There'll be time for questions at the end, and if you have any questions, please use the question box in your control panel on the right-hand side of the screen, and we will aim to get through as many as possible. If we do not get time to answer all the questions, your usual Field Fisher contacts will follow up with you individually after the session. All our sessions are recorded and available on Field Fisher website and your YouTube channel. So, let's get started. Over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Nick. This webinar is about bullying and harassment in the context of lockdown and post-lockdown, or as it's becoming known, the new normal. However, of course, as Nick said, these aren't new issues, and various forms of bullying and harassment have been very much in the news in the last few years. There are a lot of numbers out there around bullying and harassment. We've pulled together some stats from a report published by the CIPD in January. You'll see these up on your screens now. According to these figures, 15% of employees surveyed said that they had experienced bullying in the last 3 years.
Your mummy.
Worryingly, in 40% of these cases, employees reported that their managers were responsible. 8% of employees surveyed said that they had suffered harassment, and 4% of employees said that they had been sexually harassed. The next particularly concerning one. 24% of the employees surveyed said that they did not believe that bullying and harassment issues were dealt with appropriately by their employer, and that issues were swept under the carpet. I should add that these statistics are some of the more conservative figures out there. Some statistics suggest that up to a quarter, or even up to half of employees have suffered bullying or harassment at work. These issues tend to be exacerbated by wider political events, and we've seen a few flashpoints recently. The Brexit vote in 2016, for example, was a hugely polarising event and triggered very strong emotional reactions in people who perhaps are not usually very politically active. It was followed by reports of increased hate speech and racial abuse in public and an uptick in workplace disputes, as employees at different ends of the political spectrum clashed. Another flashpoint was the #MeToo movement, which started out in 2017. While the movement has doubtless resulted in a lot of positive developments, people have reacted and continue to react very strongly. It has, perhaps rightly, lowered a lot of people's tolerance threshold and brought long-buried issues out to be worked through in the open. The next flashpoints are already quite apparent. Black Lives Matter has created a much-needed open debate around racism in our society, which we expect may bring some strong views out. And Brexit remains the political hot potato it ever was, as we steer toward the UK's exit from the European Union at the end of the year. So what types of behaviours are we talking about when we refer to bullying and harassment, and particularly to cyberbullying and online harassment? Harassment and sexual harassment in the technical sense are dealt with under the Equality Act. Harassment is unwanted conduct with the purpose or effect of violating a person's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, or degrading working environment for a person. Sexual harassment similarly is dealt with in the Equality Act and broadly defined to cover behaviours from very serious physical assaults to innuendos, insinuations, or even non-targeted use of sexualized language in the workplace. You'll see that we've put up a few other terms there, bullying and exclusion. These terms have no technical and legal meaning, and we could have put up any number of others. The point is that it's important to keep in mind that these issues are broader than the behaviours covered by the Equality Act. Some dispute in a work context is normal, and the line between healthy disagreement and normal working relationships on the one hand and bullying behaviour on the other can be hard to draw. It will also depend very much on the reaction of the person affected. One person's criticism is another person's vicious personal attack. A person can feel bullied or isolated at work by a wide variety of things. A few examples would include being assigned an unmanageable workload, being subjected to harsh or public criticism, whether or not that criticism might be fair under the circumstances, being spoken to unkindly, being excluded from a work social event or a work social group, being subjected to microaggressions, such as a manager not saying good morning at the beginning of the day or goodbye at the end. I want to emphasize again, individuals can perceive behavior that is intended to be completely innocuous as bullying or harassing. A good example of this is receiving large numbers of emails out of hours. Now, the cyber in cyberbullying doesn't denote a different kind of behavior. It's really just the forum for the conduct. In circumstances where large numbers of employees are working from home, this will increasingly be online, such as during lockdown or likely for some time after lockdown, in emails, via instant messenger, on social media, whether corporate or otherwise, via text or another messaging app, or by phone. I'll hand back to Nick at this point to talk about how these issues impact an employer.
Thank you, Hannah. It can be all too easy to dismiss comments in an email via messenger that may be unkind or may cause offence as sort of interpersonal issues between employees. In other words, if two employees don't get on, an employer may take the view that this is not its problem or even not its business. However, bullying and harassment among the workforce create very real risks, both legal and commercial, for employers. Looking at the more obvious legal risk first, employers are likely to be vicariously liable for an employee's breach of the Equality Act. So, for example, if an employee harasses a colleague with racial slurs, then the employer will be liable unless they can show they have done everything reasonably practicable to prevent such harassment from occurring in the workforce. More broadly, employers have a general duty to take all reasonable steps to ensure the health and safety of their workforce. This will include safeguarding employees' mental health. An employer will be in breach of this duty if they have not taken steps to ensure that employees are not bullied or harassed at work. Perhaps less obviously, there is the implied duty of trust and confidence. Breaches of this duty create the risk of constructive unfair dismissal claims from employees whose lives have been made miserable by a bullying manager, or, importantly, whose concerns have not been addressed when raised. Besides the legal risks, bullying and harassment can have very serious commercial impacts. An unhappy workforce is generally an unproductive one. Additionally, where there are bullying or harassment issues in a team, you will generally see high staff turnover, which again can have an impact on productivity and also creates unnecessary costs for employers in connection with recruitment. So why are we talking about this now? The COVID-19 pandemic has created new challenges for employers. A long lockdown in the UK has seen employees who are able to do their job from home, working from home for long periods. In industries where remote working is possible, we're likely to see a lasting shift towards increased flexible working. And having teams together in the office may, for many industries, be a thing of the past in post-pandemic Britain. Boundaries between work life and home life become blurred when employees are working in their pajamas or in their bedrooms and with their children around them. The boundaries between working time and private life likewise become blurred without a physical separation between work and life and without a commute. This can create situations that become overfamiliar, which may increase the risk of inappropriate comments being made. It also creates a temptation for work-related communications to continue out of hours, where staff are managing work around other commitments, which can create a more pressured environment for staff who are trying to keep normal hours. It perhaps comes as no surprise that the sectors that hit the headlines 18 months ago for bullying and harassment were those where the boundaries were more likely to be blurred, where the workplace was, say, a hotel room rather than an office, or where employees worked long antisocial hours. We've also seen an increased use of non-corporate platforms such as WhatsApp or Facebook to help teams stay socially connected and to promote that water cooler chats. This brings more and more informal interactions into written communications. An inappropriate joke, which may be quickly passed over in a face-to-face interaction, may be taken out of context and amplified when it's received in written form. The risks are exacerbated by the fact that people are under stress in their private lives. The pandemic has created a climate of great economic uncertainty, and many are feeling less secure in their jobs. Economic worries will be compounded by stressful home situations as families are cooped out for long periods, parents are struggling with caring situations, and everyone is suffering from the separation from friends and family with little outlook for stress. So, the risk that employers will let out their stresses on each other or stray into over-personal communications are heightened at times like these, and boundaries may no longer be sufficiently clear to act as a check. For employers, there's the additional concern in that fact that the communications are now so often in a written or recorded medium. This not only increases the risk of misunderstanding, but it also creates a paper trail that can make the informal resolution of issues more difficult. In a worst-case scenario, it also forms the bulk of evidence in a tribunal claim. So, Hannah, what can employers do?
Thanks, Nick. To be clear, we're not advocating a completely new approach to bullying and harassment. Most employers will have strong policies and processes in place and will have been working to promote a positive culture for some time already. However, the pandemic and the new ways of working that have come with it do create new risks. It's therefore advisable for employers to look at what additional measures can be put in place to protect against them. Training for managers is going to be absolutely key. Managers are key in setting the tone and spotting and heading off issues. Also, thinking back to the CIPD stats, it seems that managers can, perhaps often inadvertently, be part of the problem. Managing from a distance is particularly challenging and requires specific skills. Training should focus broadly on managing remotely effectively, motivating staff, and most importantly, staying approachable so that employees feel able to raise issues. Role modeling good online behavior is also important, for example, in team email chains or WhatsApp groups. Managers will generally set the tone in group communications, so it's vital that even more informal communications stay on the right side of the line. Setting and respecting boundaries can be challenging. I'm thinking particularly here of out-of-hours communications. A manager may, for example, have childcare commitments, may need to return to work in the evening to complete a task. This could involve sending a number of emails to team members, commenting on work, or asking for work. Managers need to be aware that it can be stressful and even distressing for employees to receive a barrage of emails outside working hours, and that it may create a pressure or sense of expectation for employees to keep similar hours. This is something that managers need to be encouraged to be sensitive to and to work to counteract. Lastly, it's always important that managers are able to spot warning signs that their reports are unhappy or distressed. This is much more difficult when managers can't actually see team members. It's therefore more important than ever for managers to be given the tools to spot an employee who's becoming withdrawn or being ostracized from the team, or who's struggling with a particular colleague. A particular challenge of lockdown that has been identified from the start is how to keep teams engaged and socially engaged when they're not able to see one another. Many teams have put virtual social events and forums in place to address this challenge. These are important, but it is equally important that they're designed with the particular risks in mind, and that they're designed in a way that allows the employer to monitor them for inappropriate conduct or communications, and to take quick informal corrective action if necessary. We've spoken a bit about steps that you can and should be taking to prevent bullying and harassment issues arising in the first place. However, it's simply not possible to eliminate risk completely. I'll therefore look briefly now at what happens when things do go wrong and how you might need to adjust your approach in the context of the pandemic. Solutions will need to be tailored to businesses and, of course, to situations, so we won't pretend to have all the answers in a half-hour webinar. But I do think it might be helpful to signpost some of the areas that you may want to take a fresh look at through this lens of adapting them for COVID and post-COVID working. First of all, you should take a look at your policies to make sure that they address lockdown situations appropriately. Policies will generally give illustrative examples of types of conduct that are problematic. You may wish to expand these to cover more examples applicable in a remote working situation. You may also want to take another look at your informal reporting channels to make sure that they remain appropriate. Approaching a manager about a sensitive problem is difficult at the best of times, but it will be more difficult in situations where an employee needs to pick up the phone or put a concern in writing, and they can't just drop by. One solution may be for managers or HR members to proactively reach out to staff periodically to build a remote rapport and make it easier for staff to come to them in problem situations. You may also want to take a look at the tech solutions on the market to assist employers with these types of issues. There are now a number of programs available that create a confidential reporting channel and allow employees to monitor follow-up. Once an issue has come to light, you might need to adjust your approach to managing that issue informally. Managing an issue informally when one or more affected parties are not in the office can be very difficult, as you can't get parties in a room together. It's worth having alternative solutions ready, such as meeting with an HR representative present in neutral locations, even outside, to seek to resolve matters when things come to a head. Where issues can't be handled informally, the enduring increase in remote working will likely influence your approach to managing investigations and more formal processes. Investigations are likely to have to deal with much greater volumes of document evidence in situations where bullying or harassing behaviour has gone online. So you may need to devote more resources to an investigation than you have done previously. Thought will also need to be given to how witness interviews will be managed when parties are working remotely, and you'll need to ensure that you have adequate tech solutions in place to conduct interviews in an appropriate setting. Finally, there are obvious challenges in conducting disciplinary or grievance procedures remotely. Depending on the issues, it may in some circumstances be best to simply postpone key meetings until they can be held in person. However, that may not always be possible, so employers should ensure that appropriate and stable video conferencing facilities are available. For meetings conducted remotely, employers may want to take steps to ensure that employees are not creating recordings, and make clear that any unauthorized or covert recording will be taken very seriously and dealt with as a disciplinary matter. Now, before we wrap up, Nick will briefly touch on issues involving third parties.
Thank you, Hannah. We've spoken a lot about the more obvious ways in which bullying and harassment issues can come into play at work. However, these issues also arise in situations involving third parties, which can be a lot more difficult to manage, not least from a commercial point of view. What if, for example, an employee suffers harassment by a third party, such as a client or a supplier? Under the Equality Act, as it currently stands, employers are not liable for acts of harassment by third parties. However, that does not mean that employers do not have a responsibility to protect their employees and more severe forms of harassment may bring health and safety duties into play. Conversely, what if a third party accuses an employee of bullying and harassment? Perhaps counterintuitively, dealing with third-party harassment may actually be easier in circumstances where the offending behaviour is recorded in written form. Under normal circumstances, sort of he said, she said may be very difficult to manage from a relationship point of view. However, where either an employer or a third-party business partner can present a body of written evidence of offending conduct, this may move disputes to a more objective level. It's not only employees' work life that has moved online to a greater extent than before. During lockdown, more and more of our private life has also gone online. This can create very difficult issues where the private bleeds into the public. For example, we've seen several cases during lockdown where employers have had to deal with accusations made against employees anonymously relating to conduct that has no connection to their work life. This can put employers in a very difficult position. Where there is no connection with the work, it can be very difficult for an employer to investigate. However, where the accusations are serious, for example in domestic abuse situations, there may be a duty on the employer to take steps to ensure that employees do not pose a risk to the wider workforce. As an aside, many of you may have seen that the government's launched a review on employment rights for domestic abuse survivors. That review is looking at the availability of flexible working and unplanned leave, and also at ways to tackle economic abuse, for example, by paying money into a different bank account or making emergency salary payments. If you want to share your views on this subject, then there's currently a call for evidence, which closes on the 9th of September this year. Another particularly unpleasant form of online crime that has been on the increase in lockdown is revenge porn, the practice of posting intimate imagery of a sexual partner, generally an ex-partner, online without their consent, with the aim of humiliating or injuring them. This can be a difficult issue for an employer to deal with if the employee falls victim to such a crime, as the victim's reputation can unfairly be seriously damaged. In some industries, this can also be damaging for an employer. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to these emerging problems. In the first instance, it would almost always be the right course of action to speak to the affected employee. We'd strongly advise that you seek legal advice if issues cannot be resolved informally and more formal action becomes necessary. Now, I did say at the start that we'd have the opportunity to ask questions, and I see that there's a few questions that have already come in. So, Hannah, over to you. Are there any interesting ones you want to pose and share with me?
Absolutely, thanks, Nick. I think perhaps one to start with is one that links to what you've just been saying. I'll just read it out. What if we receive an allegation about something in an employee's private life that raises potential safeguarding concerns?
Oh, okay. Not going to warm me up to the, okay, that's, in terms of safeguarding, let's just be clear so we understand. On safeguarding concerns, I'm assuming we're talking about concerns that might relate to a minor or vulnerable adult. Hannah and I in particular have dealt with a number of allegations along these lines, particularly around online chat with minors, which you might see as or being referred to as grooming. For employers that perhaps deal with children in the nature of the business or vulnerable adults, then I suspect they'll have established and robust safeguarding protocols in place, which also include reporting and liaising with police and local authority designated officers. And any investigation or response to an allegation, I would strongly suggest that you deal with within that established framework. There'll be other employers, though, that perhaps don't have that direct link with children or vulnerable adults that won't have those established safeguarding policies in place. And those allegations may not appear in the first instance to be directly relevant to your work or the workplace, but there are other considerations that might come into play, in particular whether there's wider concerns about this individual and the protection of other employees and their health and safety. And for most organizations, a reputational issue. So I think it would be important to look at how you respond and scope any investigation in the context of those considerations. And where, particularly in the nature of these types of allegations, where the police may be involved, either already or because you've notified them of your involvement, then you also need to be very careful in the way that you would respond or scope any investigation so that you don't prejudice the criminal investigation. And so it's important to liaise with the assigned police officer in the case. So, I mean, in summary, I'd say that it does depend on the nature of the allegation and your business, but in all cases, it's not something that you could simply ignore, and it's something that you'll need to give consideration to in terms of the response and what is proportionate then in terms of any follow-up investigation.
Great, thanks, Nick. Here's one, I think, on investigations. I'll read it out for you. I don't have the resources in my team to carry out a big document review. What sort of investigation is reasonable?
Okay. Well, we touched on how it might be easier to investigate allegations of cyberbullying because a lot of that will be in a written medium rather than having to rely on the he said, she said evidence. But although you might be presented with some written evidence, you'd almost certainly want to look at the wider context, and that might mean you're looking at emails or other social media messaging to give you that context. And I have every sympathy with that questioner in terms of actually the resource and investment then in carrying that out, because anyone who's been involved, say, in a data subject access request will know that when they put in certain search terms, you can get back a very large data set when it comes to emails and other electronic messaging. So there's various ways that you can deal with that. Certainly, when it comes to a tribunal, when they look at what is a reasonable investigation, they will look at the size and resources of an employer. But where you have an HR team in place that will almost certainly expect you to have done some document review. So if you are in that situation where you have a large data set, there's perhaps various ways that you can approach it. One is to look at the ways that you could perhaps refine those search to look and see if you can identify a more relevant data set and a more manageable one for you. And there's various tools that you may have within your own organization to refine that search, and there's various tools that we use to be able to refine and narrow the searches, which allows you to do things in a more manageable way. There are some cases where that's not possible, and perhaps you'll need to bring in extra additional resource. And certainly there have been cases where we've assisted in any document review. Likewise, when it comes to the investigation, you may look to bring in an external investigator, an HR consultant, if you don't have the capacity or bandwidth to deal with the investigation yourself. And there may be cases, dare I say it, where a lawyer may even be involved in that investigation, where perhaps it's not looking at an individual complaint where you'd want to do an open investigation, but it's hinting at a more structural or systemic issue. And you might want to do that in a privileged environment to understand the nature and the extent of the concern. So I think there are ways that you can manage it. But it's certainly something, if you get a large data set back, that's not a reason in itself not to do the review.
Thanks, Nick. Great. I think we have time for maybe just one more briefly. What do you do about inappropriate humour on a team WhatsApp group if no one is complaining?
I mean, I don't think this is dissimilar to I'm just having a look and see who's the questioner, someone in HR, so I'll answer it in that context. I mean, it's not a dissimilar approach to where if you'd overheard it at the coffee machine or at a bar. It's very easy for us to jump straight into perhaps a formal process. But I think those things can be managed initially informally, and certainly for you to approach the individual that may have said that and may have had no intent to offend, but point out that perhaps was offensive or could be perceived as inappropriate and offensive. And of course, if that comment or chat was directed at an individual, to reach out to that affected individual as well, but on an informal basis initially to ensure that they are okay following that conversation. So I would deal it initially informally.
Thanks, Nick. All right, thank you all very much for your questions. I'm afraid I don't think we have time to answer any more. Nick, if I can briefly hand over to you to wrap things up then.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. And thank you everyone for joining today's session on cyberbullying. We hope you found it useful. As I mentioned at the beginning, all our sessions are recorded and can be found on our website and on the Phil Fisher YouTube channel. I'm sorry if we did not get to all of your questions, but if you have questions which we're not able to answer, your usual Field Fisher contact will follow up with you individually. Next week, my fellow partners, Barry Walsh and Julie Austin, in our Dublin office, will be providing an update on Ireland's response to the pandemic. Until then, keep safe, and we hope you can join us next week. Thank you.